Minister of Health?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
I'm trying to turn on my video.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. Just let me just grab the order. Forgive me. Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill entitled the Public Health Amendment Number 2, Act 2021 be now read the second time.
Are there any objections? There are none. Continue, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Public Health Amendment Number 2, Act 2021 provides for a revision of aspects of the fixed penalty regime for the enforcement of COVID-19 preventive measures. This will enhance the enforcement provisions to ensure the safety of our residents, in particular, the most vulnerable. The purpose of this legislation, Mr. Speaker, is to provide further for the creation of a ticketing regime for breaches of the public health and quarantine legislation that relate to COVID-19 in order to more efficiently enforce penalties for activities that present a material risk to the public. The regime follows the legislative regime for traffic tickets found in the Traffic Offenses Penalties Act 1974, where the hearing of any defense to an alleged breach will be in the courts. The aim is to relieve pressure on the courts in the enforcement of a select number of offenses. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that amendments introduced fixed penalty regimes for public health and quarantine legislation were passed in March of this year. However, upon further development, it was determined that further changes were needed for operational purposes. Mr. Speaker, as we are all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage globally and locally. While the country is increasingly close to achieving community protection through vaccinations or herd immunity in technical public health terms, there still remains, Mr. Speaker, continued need for protective measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 and to protect lives. Despite COVID-19 fatigue in the population, and an increasingly vocal minority who feels disenfranchised by these unfortunately essential public health measures, compliance with public health and traveler rules continues to be high. However, when breaches occur, enforcement continues to be difficult because of the prolonged process required to prosecute offenders through the courts. Mr. Speaker, this amendment remains focused on the enforcement of COVID-19 breaches that are considered to be material breaches. The types of COVID-19 breaches that occur can be categorized in three types: serious breaches that immediately endanger public health and safety, material breaches that present high risk of COVID-19 transmission, minor breaches that introduce risk of COVID-19 spread. Mr. Speaker, serious breaches such as knowingly exposing others to a communicable disease will be prosecuted through the courts as required by the relevant legislation. Minor breaches such as not wearing a mask in a designated place can be addressed with a simple reminder by any member of the public or a regiment or police officer. And material breaches fall between the other two in nature and risk. Such breaches include, for example, withholding contact tracing information from a health officer or participating in or hosting a gathering above the number legally allowed. Mr. Speaker, the material breaches are the types of offenses to which a fixed penalty is intended to be attached. This Honorable House has already supported the government in the view that such breaches can be better enforced with a fixed penalty or ticketing regime by trained officers. What this amendment does is restrict that power to issue the ticket to a police or regiment officers and to make some additional consequences changes to the bill, such as it provides for a police officer to issue a public health penalty ticket where a person commits an offense, and it removes this power from public health officers. And this enables fixed penalties to be in effect sooner through the police powers and trained officers. Excuse me. It provides for public health penalty tickets to apply to the various offenses under the Public Health and Quarantine Emergency Powers Regulations. It increases the ticketing penalty from $1,500 to $3,000 for offenses of refusing to answer questions as required by a police officer. This is to cover instances where an individual may refuse to identify themselves so that the fixed penalty can be issued to the proper person. And it provides for the minister to prescribe the content of a public health penalty ticket in regulations. The form of the public health penalty ticket will be published by the Bermuda Police Service on their website. This is so that the current fixed penalty tickets used by the police can be used for the purposes of public health penalty tickets. Mr. Speaker, more importantly, the bill ensures that persons who pay the penalty within 28 days do not receive a criminal conviction. And it also provides for persons to contest a ticket in court where they believe they are innocent. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Health consulted with the Bermuda Police Service and the Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as the Magistrates Court and with the Attorney General's chambers in the development of the policy for a ticketing regime for the enforcement of COVID-19 enforcement measures. I'm grateful for the assistance of all of those. Mr. Speaker, when we do go into committee, I will be making 2 minor amendments, which I will have forwarded to your clerk, Mr. Speaker, which I will have forwarded to the clerk, if not already done so momentarily.
I will have to confirm so we can make sure they are circulated.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I will take my leave.
Okay. I'm going to ask for if there are any other speaker, and in the meantime, I'm going to confirm that we have seen those amendments because they will be needed for when you go into committee. Any other
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the amendments. I haven't received any amendments. I don't know if the office has.
Okay, at this point, we have no notification that we will need the. No, Minister, both Mrs. Beal and Madam Clerk have indicated that we have not received them, and as you know, we will need them to circulate it.
I will do that right now myself, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Okay, and you can send it so we can get it on the SharePoint so all members will have a copy of it. Okay. Would any other member wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. MP Pearman.
MP Pearman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst that confusion is dealt with, I have a few brief points. I do have some questions in committee for the Honorable and Learned Minister, but just a few brief points on the bill. It sometimes helps just to step back and look at what the bill is doing for those who haven't had a chance to look at it in detail. Effectively, this is an amending act that's amending 2 pieces of legislation. It's amending the Public Health Act, 1949, as amended, which is the act that encapsulates most but not all of our COVID provisions and deals with the fixed penalty regime. And secondly, this amending act today is amending one aspect of the Quarantine Act 2017, which deals with another cluster of COVID-related laws, namely those dealing with quarantine. If one steps back and looks at this at a high level, I think the common sense question that one might pose is, given that we've been told this week that the vast majority of COVID restrictions are to be lifted, why some 15 to 18 months later are we now making changes to the penalty regime? And so I think that would be the overarching question that I would respectfully direct to the Honorable and Learned Minister to address in response. Looking a little bit below the surface, the bill is effectively doing 2 substantive things. One is that it is increasing penalties, although in fact it's increasing those penalties by the amendments, which I understand are making their way to the Clerk of the House now. But my understanding is that the penalties will increase from, in Clause 8, from $3,000 up to $10,000. And in Clause 11, it will increase from $1,500 all the way up to $10,000. So again, without being overly simplistic, what this amending bill is doing is seeking to give greater teeth, financial teeth, in terms of penalties to breaches of the COVID restrictions. And again, we might ask why that's coming now. Why are the amounts going up? it also might be sensibly pointed out that whilst one is increasing the penalties applicable, those penalties, of course, are only ever paid if someone is in fact charged and convicted. So one mustn't forget that simply putting the numbers up to add some teeth doesn't really do much if the enforcement isn't there in the first place. Mr. Speaker, the second thing that this bill is doing, and in my view it's a sensible thing, is it's recognizing that the penalties for breaches of these various regulations, wherever they may be, or whichever act they may flow from, isn't something that is likely to lead to a criminal conviction, but can be dealt with by financial penalty, and that the criminal courts only get involved in the event that a person wishes either not to pay the penalty or to or chooses to contest whether they should pay the penalty. So those who say, okay, I breached something, they pay the fine, and it doesn't flood the criminal court with additional cases relating to COVID breach. And given that we all very much hope we're on the downslope of COVID in Bermuda, or perhaps even at level ground below the downslope, certainly as a hope, that makes eminent good sense not to clog up the criminal courts with criminal actions. Mr. Speaker, I've addressed the amendments, and no doubt we'll hear more about those in committee when we get there. As I say, I do have a few points to deal with in committee. Whilst the Honourable Minister is making amendments to the bill, may I also take the liberty of pointing out that in the explanatory memorandum, right at the end, there appears to be a typo in that I think it is supposed to say that the change in threshold for prosecution is changing from, quote, failed without reasonable excuse, end quote, for a term willfully omits, in quotes. And I think the word omits should be there. And that's the very last sentence of the back page of the explanatory memorandum. But that's how I read it. I think the word is missing. The final question that I would address to the Minister before committee is to invite the Minister just to clarify what exactly is going on, because here we have a bill seeking to amend the penalties. In a moment, we are to discuss an order seeking to extend emergency powers. What we don't have in front of us today are any regulations relating to the rules that are supposed to come into effect on Sunday. And so perhaps the Minister could just kindly update the Honourable House as to when we may see the regulations that are coming into effect this Sunday. I don't know if any other colleagues wish to speak, but thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable and Learned Minister for her presentation on this bill.
Thank you, MP. Does any other MP wish to make a contribution? No one else? Minister?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry, Deputy? Deputy?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill is designed, or it's being enacted to increase penalties, Mr. Speaker, based on quarantine. But let me say, Mr. Speaker, that I think the government has done very well last year in the way they've handled this pandemic, and to some extent this year. But I have some concerns, Mr. Speaker, about the quarantine. Mr. Speaker, I think the quarantine is discriminatory based on the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. I think, Mr. Speaker, you probably read or heard on television last night that the hoteliers have instituted, some of the hotels have instituted a program where those that are unvaccinated will be tested every 7 days, and the vaccinated will not. I really, in my heart, don't believe that the hoteliers meant to put policy in place that is discriminatory, but it is. I agree with testing every 7 days. particularly in the hotel and the restaurant industry, because I think we have to keep our customers safe as well as each other safe, Mr. Speaker. So I would urge the hoteliers, and I think the Bermuda Industrial Union came out with a statement, and I endorsed it. They're not against testing, but we cannot discriminate because, Mr. Speaker, it's been proven that even though you get vaccinated, you can pass the virus on. We saw or read yesterday or heard on television about the ship, and I think it was 4 crew members came down with the virus now, and they had been vaccinated. So that proves the point that everyone should be tested, whatever the policy is. Mr. Speaker, I have problems with the quarantine discriminatory part of it, where if one is, they left the island, and before they can come back, they have to get what is called a TA approval form, and that is to have booked up into a hotel. That's if you're unvaccinated. The discriminatory part about it, Mr. Speaker, is that if you don't have this form, then I'm told that you cannot get on the flight. Well, I don't think that you can deny me my right to come home. When I get home, what you do is something different. But it's got to be, common sense tells me it's against the law. They cannot deny me once I've been tested as the policy, and I've got my ticket and all my travel documents. I should be able to get on that flight. The other concern I have is if I come back home and I test negative and I'm not vaccinated, I have to go in a quarantine for 14 days at my expense. But the person that comes back who is vaccinated and tested positive for the virus, they can go home and quarantine at home. And if they test negative after the 4th day, then they can go out in the public. And I know if I have this wrong, the minister will correct me. But that's discriminatory, because if I'm coming back, vaccinated or not, and I test negative, then I should be able to go home and quarantine. I'm not against quarantine, Mr. Speaker, because I believe and I agree with our government's objective in trying to control this pandemic so we can get back to normal. I am right there. No problem with me. And I feel that if one comes back, whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated, and they test positive, they should be able to quarantine at home, providing the environment home is right. You don't want to send a person home and you got 4 or 5 others home. You don't want to do that. But there's got to be some balance here. And if I was one of them, I wouldn't mind wearing the bracelet. And I know the bracelet is very successful because I do know of a lady that had the bracelet on, and apparently she got a cold while she was home. And I guess those that were monitoring the bracelet said to her, "Where are you? Because we can't see you." And the lady replied, "My computer's down," so they couldn't see her. And that goes to the point that, hey, and I think it was good that they called her to find out where she was. And that could be done for anyone, Mr. Speaker. Now, you can always have some people like we have in society that they like to break the law for whatever reason. You know, you're going to have them. But the point I'm trying to make is don't penalize the 95 or 97% people that will abide by all the rules as we do on a daily basis, Mr. Speaker. I think the job that Dr. Relevant is doing in Tesla it's above the top. And I really get mad when I hear people, and it only happens to people particularly black people, when something doesn't go their way, they question what another black is making. Nothing to do with the qualification, but I think Dr. Belwin is doing an exceptional job. And I think that foolish talk must stop. It's got to stop, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have a problem with the minister said, I don't know if she wasn't sure what she's saying, and I don't mean that out of no disrespect. The minister said if the fine is not paid within 28 days, there's no criminal record. And I know what the act says, and I think she said it right. There's no criminal record if it's not paid within 28 days, but they will take action to get the money. I understand that. Mr. Speaker, some people will say, well, why are you leaving the island if you can't afford to pay for a hotel and coming back? Mr. Speaker, the answer is quite obvious. Mr. Speaker, on this little 20 square mile island, you get rock fever. And the only cure for rock fever is to take a trip. Some people just have enough money for their ticket and everything else is on the credit card. Now, I'm not saying that's a good decision now, but that's what people do in order to alleviate that rock fever. And they come back and they take a year, 18 months to pay it off. That's us. That's what we do. So don't tell people don't take a trip, because those that have the fun, they take the trip, and that privilege should be given to everyone. Now the other thing is, Mr. Speaker, and I understand the quarantine, I'm not knocking, but my concern is a person going in quarantine for 2 weeks, and they're paying anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000, $5,000, depending on what facility you go in. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, is the two weeks wages you lose. Most Bermudians can't afford that. One thing this government has done, and I applaud it, there is never, ever a charge for our students returning home. It's changed a bit because I know when the policy first came out, students didn't have to quarantine. And the change that made, and I agree with it, that students will quarantine, but at the expense of the taxpayer. I have no problem with that, Mr. Speaker. So the point I'm trying to make is students never had to pay, Mr. Speaker. But the one that really, really, really concerns me is against my human rights. I think it's discriminatory when you tell me that if I don't have a TA, I can get on the plane. Maybe the government will come with an amendment to that, because that part of that, I'm for discrimination all my life, Mr. Speaker, and I will continue to do that. And I'm one that cannot stand by and watch discrimination on anybody at this stage in my life and at this stage in the life of all of us. Discrimination in any form is not right. We have to fix that. Again, and I say, the government, I have praise for the government. Our ratings as far as how we handle this and the total number of vaccinations is high ranking in the world. But this little piece about mandatory quarantine, I think we could fix that and do it better. We could do that part better. And the other part is, don't tell me or anyone that you cannot come home because you haven't booked up on a hotel coming back home. That's not correct. You just cannot tell me that. I can't accept that. Mr. Speaker, one thing I must say, with wearing these masks has been a benefit to us all. And I would wear the mask as long as I think is necessary. Even if the government says you don't have to wear a mask tomorrow, I would wear it, because one thing I can say, I haven't heard about any flu. And I think it's because people are wearing masks, you haven't heard about the flu anymore. I think it's a good thing to do, to wear the mask, particularly when you're in areas where you you feel or you should be protected, Mr. Speaker. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I want to say again to the hoteliers, you must test everybody. Being vaccinated does not guarantee you, does not exempt you, does not stop you from passing the virus on. So I would ask that any discriminatory policy, whether it be the private sector, whether it be government, that we not do that. We shouldn't be doing it, not at this stage in our lives. And again, let me be clear. I understand the objective. I agree with the objective of the government. But certain things we just cannot fall away from some principles. We got to stick to the principles. We got to treat, and I know it's not the intent of anyone, particularly the government, to treat anybody unfairly. But this it doesn't come out, it is discriminatory, and we shouldn't have it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Does any other member wish to make a contribution at this time?
Mr. Speaker,
Yes?
MP Campbell.
MP Campbell? You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the intent of the measures put in place by the government in this battle against the COVID-19 virus has always been to protect the health and well-being of the citizens of Bermuda. The intent wasn't to penalize individuals financially. The intent wasn't to create criminal convictions on individuals' records. So, as has been pointed out by the minister and also the opposition spokesperson for health that spoke earlier, this bill strengthens the teeth for those who violate the various COVID-19 protocols. But it also allows for a method to enforce the regulations without creating a criminal conviction on an individual's record. Mr. Speaker, I wish there was a test that we could apply to those re-entering or entering Bermuda that would tell us whether or not they would adhere to the mandatory quarantine protocols at home. I really do wish we had a test as to whether we could hook someone up to a machine or a bubble appeared above their head that showed us their intentions. But we don't have such a test. So how do we know who will violate the quarantine regulations? Mr. Speaker, I really like this ticketing process for what would be called material breaches. And what I'm hopeful is that we will gather data in the initial phases of this that we can utilize later. What do I mean by that? Well, we all know that we cannot continue our economy cannot survive, particularly the hospitality industry, with heavy restrictions in place. So what I'm hoping is that we will gather enough information to show that we can effectively use a ticketing system in conjunction with the increased penalties to move away from the mandatory quarantine process in a government facility and allow people to quarantine at home initially, and then eventually move away from having to quarantine altogether. As I said, the country cannot, our economy cannot continue to bear the losses that are being caused by COVID in general, and that may be occurring specifically due to the restrictions that we have in place. And I'm 100% behind protecting our people and protecting our borders. But I do understand that for some, this will seem overly burdensome. So I'm hopeful that we can utilize this ticketing method, gather some data that will allow us to move away from the quarantine, the mandatory quarantine process in a government facility. And I'll put it out there. I don't think the intention is that will be with us permanently. I don't think the intention was that we would be fighting COVID 16, 17 months after our first cases arrived. But we are. So again, I will conclude my brief comments by saying that I'm hopeful that we will utilize the data collected, particularly around this ticketing process, to move away from the mandatory quarantine process in a government facility and allow people to quarantine at home. But again, I will state, we don't have that test. It would be lovely to have that test that helps us identify those who will break protocols if allowed to quarantine at home. So I'm cautious in that optimism, because if we do not respect the protocols, then it will result in total devastation of our economy. And that is something we will take a long time to recover from. And with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I conclude and thank you.
Thank you, MP Campbell. Does any other member wish to make a contribution at this time?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
MP Lester, I see you there. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to add a few brief comments to this debate today, Mr. Speaker. I believe the objective and the intent of these the health order and the quarantine order, I think we all, the public of Bermuda, we all understand and get what the objective is to keep our borders safe and to keep locally, internally, keep Bermuda safe. I don't think anyone can disagree with that, Mr. Speaker. But as has been mentioned before by the previous speakers before me, Mr. Speaker, the intent, even though it is unintended, has caused discriminatory issues, Mr. Speaker, between those that are vaccinated and unvaccinated. And Mr. Speaker, when I speak, I have to speak on my principle of anti-discrimination. Whether it is based on age, sex, religion, choice, discrimination is wrong no matter how or where it is, Mr. Speaker. So while we all support and understand the precautions put in place, it has unintentionally caused discrimination that affects a sector of our community. Much has been made, Mr. Speaker, and myself as an MP, I have gotten the calls, the messages, I've heard the cries of how this is affecting the community in Bermuda. And Mr. Speaker, again, I cannot agree or support any discrimination, any form. And I urge that another solution or other options to be used so that we are not creating discrimination and, to a wider intent or effect, Mr. Speaker, division, because it is causing division in our community. And at a time when we should be coming together, we should not be having division, dividing us at this time, Mr. Speaker. So much has been said, and it's not much more that I can say against this, because I cannot support discrimination in any form, Mr. Speaker. So those are my short comments, and there's much more that I may speak on later outside of this debate, Mr. Speaker, but those are my comments that I cannot support. I can support the policy, I can support the intent and the objective to keep our island safe, Mr. Speaker. But the unintended consequence of creating discrimination and creating division, I cannot support, Mr. Speaker. Those are just my short comments, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me the opportunity to voice my concerns in this debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. MP, would any other member like to make a contribution?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
MP Simmons, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The strength of our government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 was based on taking the people along with us, explaining why we are doing what we are doing, how we are doing what we are doing, and what the next steps and what the next phases were. When that approach was taken, the people came with us. The people walked with us, and they were comfortable with us. We have to get back to that. And when I look at how there is naturally will be resistance in quarters, regardless. But I believe that the way that we have presented this to the public has amplified and heightened tensions and divisions and created fear and uncertainty that could have been prevented. And I think that this is a learnable experience for us. I'm not going to be very long, Mr. Speaker, because I believe that the honorable member who took his seat just before me, as well as a member who spoke earlier, and I'm reminded of a saying, if you want to go far, go with a labor man. And I'm going with the labor man this afternoon, the honorable member from constituency number 5, because I believe he summed up my concerns, the concerns of many of my constituents. He summed up many of the concerns that are being felt throughout the community. We have some work to do, Mr. Speaker. We have work to do to be able to bring this country back together, to be able to get people united behind getting our economy moving and protecting our borders. We have a lot of work to do. We have trust to regain, we have confidence to regain, and we have to find a way to bring the people with us along the way. With the understanding, strong decisions do need to be made. Strong decisions have to be made, but strong decisions that are understood, explained, and have the broadest possible church participating in the decision-making process creates stronger decisions, creates better outcomes, creates better buy-in, creates wider buy-in and wider advocacy. And Mr. Speaker, so we've seen the calls against discrimination. We have seen the calls against the 28-day limit on the fines. And, I support that, which I said before. I'm not going to belabor the issue, but I do think that we have some work to do to be able to get back to that time when we were moving as one country, with one understanding of where we are going, with one understanding of the final destination and how everyone fits into it, regardless of whether we are vaccinated or unvaccinated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, MP Simmons. Would any other member wish to make a contribution at this time? Any other member?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
MP Trego, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I am duty bound to speak on this piece of legislation out of respect for the many, many calls that have come from my constituency, and not just from my constituency, but from Bermudians far and wide. Mr. Speaker, I think some of the salient points have already been made in terms of what this legislation, the effect that this legislation has on the general public. While I have to say, a government is tasked with doing what they believe is best for their people and in their best interest. And sometimes what they do has, as someone pointed out, unintended consequences. And in this particular instance, many of the policies that have been put in place to protect our people have likewise created the divide where many of our people are screaming and shouting that they are indeed being treated differently. And they feel as though they are, especially those who we've heard other members say, who are unvaccinated at this point in time. They feel as though many of the rules that have been put or that are being put in place are targeted at them, whether that be the case or not, even though, you know, governments are doing what they believe is in the best interest of all. It, because of the way the regulations are being meted out, or the legislation is being meted out, it operates and treats members of the public differently. And so I would hope, as do others, that we can find that balance that would allow all of us to enjoy treatment from the legislation in the same way. I'll put it that way. Because when you have legislation that says to a particular group, because they have not traveled down a road that the government believes puts them in a state that makes them less likely to cause unintended consequences, they are being treated differently, meaning, as has been pointed out, they will find themselves, if they were to travel and come back, being in mandatory quarantine for 14 days, even if they test negative for that entire 14 days. And so many have asked me, in fact, I walked in Hamilton this afternoon and I had one of my constituents stop me in the annex and say, I don't get it. You know, how can a vaccinated person who comes back and is positive be allowed to go home? And I can, who is unvaccinated, have to spend an inordinate amount of money and be in a facility for 14 days. And though the person said to me, I know that you cannot say or speak out against your government, I am here to tell you, as my representative, that I expect you to be fighting and doing something so that the treatment against us is different. And the person even went on to say how they had a conversation with their physician, who tried to suggest that they get a vaccination. And he said, I believe I'm already had COVID. I believe that I have the antibodies, yet I'm asking you to give me a test to see whether or not I have an immunity against COVID now. And you're saying, oh, but you should still get vaccinated. Please explain to me how that's going to improve my status. And he said his doctor did not and would not. But having had his doctor for about 20 years, he said that he understood, that she understood the logic in his words, but would not answer. And he believes that various factors have come together to operate in accord in a manner that would sort of coerce, that was his words, coerce persons like himself to get vaccinated. And so he said, I didn't vote for a government to treat me like this. And he went on to say that in the next few months, when his wife has finished doing whatever degree she's doing, if he finds himself subjected to the same treatment, he, along with his family, will pack up shop and leave, because he is not going to live in a country that discriminates against him and his family. And so this is a story that's being repeated over and over again. And I know that my government has been a government which listens to the people. And so being his voice and the voice of many others, I would ask that we continue to listen to our people and continue to try and bring about amendments that meets with the accord of everyone. Because when we would seek to put someone in isolation or in quarantine, as you would call it, who is positive but has been vaccinated and who can run the risk of spreading COVID, yet someone who's not vaccinated and is negative but has to be quarantined, and quarantined in a facility where they have to expend an inordinate amount of money, in the words of many of the people who are crying out, something is wrong with that. And so, Mr. Speaker, you know, I think others have said it. We understand this government is not trying to, I guess, if you will, it is not trying to discriminate against people. What it is trying to do is create an environment that is going to be the best possible environment where we can move forward with little fear of having the same outcomes that we have experienced in the recent past. However, the measures that are being put in place is not, I guess, if you will, bringing about the feeling that what they seek to do is what actually will happen, especially when you would have policies that that would allow persons who are positive to go home and persons who are negative to be quarantined with no in a shelter until such time that 14 days are up, even if they've never ever tested positive. And people don't accept that logic. And especially when you see from the World Health Organization, you see from the Center of Disease Control, where it has been made patently clear that persons who are vaccinated spread COVID, can still contract COVID, can still die from COVID. And regardless of whether or not their, I guess, viral count is at a certain level, which makes people feel comfortable, the truth is that the virus can still be spread and others are at risk of contracting the virus. The measures that have been, the amendments that have been made that have sought to change the fines from 3,000 to 10,000 and 1,500 to 10,000, some may argue draconian. I would hope, and I have confidence, that the minister will continue to look at those amendments with a view to where they can be modified to enjoy broader support from the public at large, while still trying to meet or mitigate, against the risks of COVID and what that may, how that may pan out in terms of the economic impact and the like, that she will continue to do so. I have no doubt that she will continue to do so, because what the Bermuda public needs to understand is that as a government, all of us are there to give our views, and through sharing our views, we must try and bring about an outcome that meets with the accord of all of us and meets with the accord of the general public, because that is who we serve, that is who put us here, and it would be, I guess, an act less than duty if we ignored that. And so, in other words, I'm saying we are duty bound to do that because the people put us there to represent their interests, all interests. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think as the other members have stated, it's a tough thing. It is not something that is met very readily when measures are put in place that, though not intended, create a divisive environment and treat people differently and therefore operate in a discriminatory manner. And I just want to say, no one is trying to do that, and that we accept that that may be the outcome. And so our job, my job, the collective job, is to continue to deal with this legislation in a manner that brings about the changes that we want, but allows persons to be treated equally under the legislation. And with those words, Mr. Speaker, I think that I should stop my commentary. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Does any other Honourable Member wish to make a contribution at this time?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Cannonair, MP Cannonair, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've taken to heart, just listening very intently and closely to what I have heard thus far, and I am pleased to hear the varying comments that are being made. Certainly, it is not always easy for government in the position that it is in and having to make tough decisions. But what I really want to get to is, where is the consultation here that is taking place as to how we are coming to the conclusions as a government and meting out these rules and regulations as we go forward? With so much being said, not just in social media, but so much being said in the newspaper and other areas, direct emails and the likes, I'm beginning to wonder exactly who's being consulted here. Is it just government making these decisions, or are we consulting on a general and a broader basis to really understand, as you've already heard in some of the comments, the people are out there who are walking about and living amongst these restrictions that are being made? And more importantly, you've heard comments to the likes of, I'm going to side with labor if I'm going to make a decision. And I commend that. I understand that very, very clearly, because some of the same people that are talking with government officials are also talking to us as an opposition, trying to come to a clearer understanding of how we have gotten to where we are today.
And so it behooves me to, and I'm trying to understand who is it that is consulting here so that we understand better how we're coming to some of these conclusions. And it really isn't clear exactly who's making these decisions. I'll say that on the precedence of this, we're just now looking at an amendment that is taking fines from $3,000 to $10,000, from $1,500 to $10,000. Now, there must be some logic and some rhyme or reasoning to why we have gotten to this place, but we have not heard clearly as of right now, even to the amendment, how do we come to increasing it to $10,000? Someone needs to explain who made this decision. Someone needs to explain how the committee or the board or whoever it is meting out these conclusions and who's involved in the consultation of getting to the position that we're in. This government has always purported that it is listening to the people. What we are seeing meted out at this time is clearly not the case at all. So where is this? Someone needs to say who the consultation is being meted with, who are the people that are making these decisions, and why are we in such a contentious position right now? Because it appears as if we're making decisions without even looking at people's constitutional rights. Or listening to caucus. Listening to caucus, whatever it is, the broad, I recall in so many cases where us as a government were called out in many, many cases, have you consulted enough? And we clearly see now that there are signs of with this government that we are not getting to a broader consultative position. So we're making decisions on behalf of the whole of Bermuda. And listen, this is a tough position that this government finds itself in, but it is faced right now with some serious opposition. And it would be nice to hear from our leaders explaining exactly how they have gotten to this position. And I say that on the backdrop of this. We were going to move forward on June the 6th. That was pushed off until June the 13th. Now it's being pushed off until Sunday. So who's consulting here? What's happening? The results clearly are showing that people are not happy. And I agree with many folks, when you're making decisions as a government, not everyone is going to be happy. But there is a general consensus as you walk about the street that things are not where we would like for them to be. People divided over this particular issue. Now, what concerns me, and I'm basing this on historical decisions that have been made, what concerns me is that while we're looking at the potential of restrictions and the likes on the unvaccinated, that this government is probably going to make a decision that will place restrictions on the vaccinated rather than lifting the restrictions on the unvaccinated. How do I come to that conclusion? I'll give you an example. Not too long ago, restrictions were lifted for St. Regis so that they could go ahead and work during the quarantine period. The restrictions were lifted only because of pressure from the public. Then did they rescind the decision of those restrictions, that liberty that St. Regis could go ahead and work, and restricted them. And I came up and wrote an article and said, listen, the right decision was to allow St. Regis to go ahead and work. The better decision would have been to not just let St. Regis work, but to let others in similar positions to also work. But what this government did was it went and restricted the very liberties that it should have allowed to happen in the first place. Why? Because they did not consult clearly enough. We saw where we had the minister at loggerheads, in my estimation, with the premier and the decision that had been made. And so the confusion was there. And what happens in the end? More restrictions were put in place upon the same people that it should not have happened. And that's my concern as we move forward, that what's going to happen with this government, due to pressure, they'll place restrictions on the vaccinated and liberalize the unvaccinated when they should be liberalizing both. And so this government's going to have to make some serious decisions. Sunday is looming, and people are anxious.
and I commend everyone for speaking their mind on this particular issue. I don't know if the whip was involved or not in this particular situation with the government, but obviously we have concerns, and we're hearing these concerns from both the government and the opposition that we are in a position that is not palatable for the people of Bermuda. And this government needs to find a way to answer the questions rather than skipping around the questions. They need to answer the questions with some qualifications. That's not what we're getting. So I'm hoping that as we move through this here, Mr. Speaker, that we'll get more answers to the questions that are being loomed, and hopefully that we'll be able to allow Bermuda to move forward as best as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, MP. Are there any members who would like to make a contribution at this time?
Mr. Speaker,
Yes,
MP Terrell.
MP Terrell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the opportunity to express some of the concerns that I have and some of the concerns that some of my constituents have shared with me. Mr. Speaker, it's already been stated that our earlier, and I'll use the word earlier, handling of the pandemic was done in a way that brought the people along with us. And I definitely agree with that because we took time to talk to people. And as you can see, we brought people along with us. Again, another example of us listening to the people. Mr. Speaker, governing is never easy. It's not easy. You never please all the people all the time. But it's certainly, during my time in government, has never been the intent to discriminate blatantly, if I could use that word, then against any one particular class or set of people. When you have, Mr. Speaker, when you have people who may deliberately be looking to break regulations, sometimes stronger methods have to be put in place. It's all part of governing. It's as I said, it's not easy. I'm not in favor of blatant discrimination, and as I said, I don't believe that that's been our intent. However, some regulations and policies may give an impression of discrimination because you have to try and protect the whole, but there are going to be a core that maybe isn't coming on board with that. As I said, I try to say that no one law is a one size fits all. It doesn't work like that. However, when legislation is done in the interest of safety, in this instance of protecting our borders, I have to support it. I will support it. Much has already been said and respect the opinion, and I respect the opinion of my colleagues. Everyone has a right, basically to say how they feel, just as I have the right as well. However, I feel duty bound to support the legislation in the interest of protecting our borders. I've listened, as I said, to my constituents. A lot of them fully understand which way the government or how the government is trying to handle it, and I can only appeal to persons at this time to give some time and look at the legislation that we are putting out, because it is in the interest of protecting our borders and the entire island. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I'll be very brief. I don't need to say much more. Everyone else has said things that I could certainly repeat, but I will end there, and I thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Terrell. Would any other member wish to speak?
Mr. Speaker?
Yes,
Yeah, Mr. Speaker,
MP Minister Scott?
yes, sir.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I want to pick up where my colleague left off, and I want to start by saying that my other colleagues that have spoken, MP Burgess, MP Fogo, MP Lister, the third, MP Campbell, they raise valid and justifiable concerns. And I think that today what I would like to do is try to paint a picture and although not try to get any one individual or group of individuals to agree, but just to understand the logic or at least the concept where the government is coming from when they make this decision. So I would like, if you could, imagine two circles, with one circle being supervised quarantine and the other circle being home quarantine. And on the outside of those two circles, it put one circle on either side. And in that circle, have it labeled WWH. What's the worst that could happen? And so when we look at supervised quarantines, what's the worst that could happen with supervised quarantines? And that has already been highlighted. And let's talk about the discrimination aspect. So let's say that it is seen that this is a discriminatory policy. There is the courts that will help decide that. So let's say that there was a court case. And what's the worst that could happen with supervised quarantines, meaning that that court case could be found to be, so let's say somebody in the public or somebody brings a court case to challenge the validity, to challenge whether or not this infringes on human rights, and it goes to court. And let's say in the worst case scenario, the courts decide in favor of that challenge. What's the worst that happens? That means that the supervised quarantine would have to fall away, find another way about it, and let's shift over. Let's say we then shift over to the home quarantining. So you've lost a court case, and more than likely, and if I'm speaking freely, there would be the validity of the government's decision-making in other future controversial decisions. So now let's shift over to the home quarantine option. What's the worst that could happen? And so we sit there and say that, let's say worst that could happen is that home quarantining does not work. Someone somewhere slips through the cracks, not necessarily somebody that gets out of quarantine, but somebody that has invited a friend over, finds out after that they've spent time together in a confined area that they're positive, and the virus gets out, and we end up with 2,000 new active cases and 25 people dead. Mr. Speaker, the government has said, looking at the two worst case scenarios, neither one of them is favorable. But we believe that we are okay with the loss of a court case, but we are not okay with the possible loss of life. And so for those that listened to my speech earlier, when I spoke about the creation of an environment and how Herculean of a task it is, this is a prime example in where the government is trying its best to create a more safe, the safest possible environment given the situation. And my understanding of the medical statistics and data that has been presented to myself is that when you get 50% of your population vaccinated, immunized, it is difficult to have an outbreak. If you were to get to the 60% threshold, it is unlikely for one to have an outbreak. But when you get to the 70% and or higher, it is highly unlikely. That is the term that was used. And the way that I interpret the words highly unlikely in this context is all but impossible to have an outbreak. So, Mr. Speaker, this is why the government is pushing to get persons vaccinated so that we can protect not just our borders through a quarantine program or initiative of some sort, but so that we can have as much safety and protection within the community without having to have controversial and or strict border management. And because the reason that we focus on having strict border management is not to discriminate, is not to make life hard, but is to protect the creation of that safe environment and to protect that safe environment from the introduction of a variant. And my understanding, and I put the disclaimer that I am not a medical professional, but my understanding of the information and the medical data that I have seen is that it is all about risk mitigation. You're not going to get it to zero, but you can try to see how close to zero one can get it. And to protect against that variant, to mitigate or reduce the risk of a variant, this is where the supervised quarantines come in. Because my understanding from the infomercials, from the medical data, from the research that I've done, is that it is more likely for a non-vaccinated or unvaccinated person to be carrying or create a variant than one from a vaccinated person. And so, therefore, we have to ensure that a variant is not introduced, that one does not slip through the cracks. But while we are not below the 70% threshold, where it would be unlikely to have an outbreak of any sort, we have to protect our borders. And with Bermuda being an island, we are uniquely able to do that. And although one thing is clear today, that although we may not all agree on the implementation or the plan of what we're doing, we do all agree on the objective. The overall objective is to protect our people. We all agree on that. And it is okay that we do not all agree on the implementation aspect of it. But also, the other thing that we all agree on is the gravity of the situation. There are literally lives at stake. The government cannot afford to get it wrong. We can afford to take criticism. We can afford to take critiques. We can afford to be unliked, because this is not about votes, voting, or party support. This is about ensuring that another Bermudian life is not lost. And so, therefore, I appreciate, I respect, and I support my fellow colleagues that speak out and sharing their concern and their unreadiness. Because we, as a government, hear you. We are listening to you. And although we may not be able to implement the plan that everybody would like to see, that everybody can agree with, we are implementing a plan that we wholeheartedly believe will achieve the objective of keeping us safe and protecting lives within this country. So, Mr. Speaker, I just want you to know, and I want those that are listening to picture those two bubbles, the supervised quarantine versus the home quarantine, and ask yourself, if they don't work, if home quarantining doesn't work, what's the worst that could happen? And if supervised quarantine doesn't work, what's the worst that could happen? And our understanding, our interpretation as a government is that with supervised quarantine, the worst that could happen is we lose a court case. But with home quarantining, we believe what's the worst that could happen is that we lose more lives. And that is a risk this government is not willing to take. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Does any other member wish to make a contribution at this time? Any other member? No other member? Minister Wilson?